It had been nearly a month since Earth's United Galactic Federation had received the message from the Marivian Empire. A lush green world known for its towering crystal cities and shimmering lakes, Marivia had always maintained a distance from the rest of the galaxy. Its people were the epitome of refinement, their mastery of bioengineering and quantum resonance elevating them to an almost mythical status within the Federation. They rarely left their tranquil world, and when they did, it was often with an air of benevolent condescension. Earth, on the other hand, was a relative newcomer to the galactic stage. It had joined the Federation only a few decades prior, its scrappy adaptability earning it curiosity but little respect. For centuries, humans had lived by trial and error, improvising their way through crises. While other species admired their resilience, they often saw it as a symptom of underdeveloped systems. Nowhere was this condescension more evident than in medicine. So when the Marivians requested an ambassadorial visit, Earth's leaders were both honored and puzzled. Why now? Earth wasn't a central hub like Centauri Prime or Arcadia, yet the Marivians had insisted, their message delivered with the same inscrutable grace that characterized their people. Simon Harrow, a middle-aged nurse with a sharp wit and a long history of working in chaotic hours, had been assigned to the summit as part of the Federation's support staff. For Simon, the summit was just another gig. His job was straightforward: provide medical backup in case anyone, human or otherwise, had a health emergency. He doubted he'd have much to do. Marivians don't get sick, his colleague, Dr. Elaine Grant, had said with a wry smile. They've got their DNA wrapped tighter than a Christmas bow. You're here for show. Simon had chuckled. Good. I could use an easy shift. He would come to regret those words. By the time the Marivians arrived in their gleaming ship, a circular vessel that shimmered like a gigantic soap bubble, Earth's delegation was already juggling diplomatic mishaps. The first misstep had been the banquet menu. Marivians, it turned out, considered Earth's meat-based dishes barbaric. Even the sight of roasted chicken had caused one aide to faint. The second misstep was more subtle but equally damning medicine. During a preliminary cultural exchange, Earth's representatives had proudly shared advances in trauma care and infectious disease treatment. Rylmar, the Marivian Grand Ambassador, had watched the presentation with polite disinterest before delivering his assessment. Fascinating. It is like watching children discover fire. The room had gone uncomfortably silent. Fire's useful Simon had muttered under his breath, earning a warning glance from Dr. Grant. Still, he couldn't shake the ambassador's words. The Marivians' disdain for Earth's methods was clear. They claimed to heal with precision, using vibrational therapies that resonated at the molecular level, manipulating the body's bioquantum frequencies. We bend the very fabric of life itself, Rylmar had explained during a public forum. You simply manage its symptoms. Simon, unimpressed, had kept his opinions to himself. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't argue with people who thought they were perfect. The summit began with all the ceremony one might expect: speeches, handshakes, and endless rounds of translated platitudes. Rylmar and his delegation were the center of attention, their flowing robes of bioluminescent silk drawing admiring glances. The Marivians moved with an effortless grace, their multicolored skin glowing faintly as if they carried the light of distant stars. To the humans, they seemed untouchable, ethereal beings who belonged more to legend than reality. But reality hit hard during the ambassador's keynote address. Rylmar was midway through a speech extolling the virtues of intergalactic cooperation when he suddenly faltered. His glowing skin dimmed, his words slurred, and he reached out for support. Gasps rippled through the audience as his legs buckled. Before anyone could react, he collapsed. Simon was on his feet before he realized what he was doing. His training kicked in, overriding any hesitation. Pushing through the stunned crowd, he reached Rylmar's side in seconds. Out of the way, he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. He knelt beside the ambassador, taking stock of the situation. Rylmar's skin felt unnaturally hot, and his breathing was shallow. Simon pressed 2 fingers to the Marivian's neck, finding a pulse that was rapid and erratic. What happened, he demanded, glancing up at the aides clustered around him. One of them, a tall figure with green and silver skin, began chanting in low, resonant tones. The other aides joined in, their hands hovering over Rylmar's body, as if performing a ritual. Simon frowned. "What are you doing?" "Restoring balance," the tall aide replied, his tone curt. Simon wasn't impressed. "Well, he's out of balance, all right. He's also burning up and barely breathing. I need saline, a thermometer, and a bioscanner. Now." The aides hesitated, their chanting faltering. One of them, a younger Marivian with anxious eyes, whispered something to the lead aide. "I said now," Simon snapped, his voice rising. The lead aide glared at him. "Your primitive tools will do more harm than good. The Grand Ambassador requires resonance alignment, not crude intervention." Simon gritted his teeth. "He requires oxygen, fluids, and someone who knows how to stabilize a collapsing circulatory system. That's me. Now either help me or get out of the way." The tension was palpable. Finally, the younger aide moved, tapping a wrist device that summoned an emergency kit. Simon grabbed the supplies and got to work. By the time the emergency transport arrived to take Rylmar to the mid-bay, Simon had managed to slow the ambassador's heart rate and lower his fever slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy time. As the shimmering field of the transporter engulfed Rylmar's limp form, Simon turned to the Marivian aides. "If you want your leader to survive, you'll have to trust me. I don't care how advanced your tech is right now. He needs care, not theories." The tall aide, whose name Simon would later learn was Nolrex, looked at him with barely concealed contempt. "You overstep, human." Simon stepped closer, meeting Nolrex's gaze. "Maybe, but at least I'm stepping up." For a moment, Nolrex said nothing. Then he turned and followed the transport team into the mid-bay. Simon exhaled, his adrenaline beginning to fade. He had a feeling this was only the beginning. The sterile white of the mid-bay was a sharp contrast to the Marivian's shimmering elegance. Rylmar lay unconscious on a diagnostic bed, surrounded by equipment from both the Earth and Marivian medical teams. Simon stood at the edge of the chaos, watching as Nolrex and his aides performed their strange ritualistic diagnostics. The lead Marivian medic waved a sleek, glowing device over Rylmar's chest, his voice calm despite the rising tension. "His resonance nodes are destabilized. This is a biofrequency collapse." Simon frowned, arms crossed. "And that means what, exactly?" "It means," Nolrex snapped, "that his body is losing harmonic integrity. We must realign the frequencies before his organs fail entirely." "Great," Simon said dryly. "And how long will that take?" "As long as it takes," Nolrex replied, his tone laced with condescension. "Your interventions are no longer required." Simon glanced at the monitors. Rylmar's vitals were erratic, heart rate spiking, oxygen saturation plummeting. His skin, once a radiant gold, had turned a dull gray. Whatever the Marivians were doing, it wasn't working. Simon stepped forward. "Look, I'm not here to argue. I'm here to keep him alive. If your fancy bio whatever isn't stabilizing him, we need to try something else." Nolrex turned, his expression sharp. "You do not understand our physiology. Your crude methods will." "Save his life," Simon interrupted. "Maybe." The room fell silent. For a moment it seemed like Nolrex might dismiss him entirely. But then the younger aide, Iller, spoke up. "He's deteriorating faster than we can compensate," Iller said, her voice hesitant. "Perhaps we should consider external stabilization." Nolrex glared at her. "You would trust this human over centuries of proven methods." Simon held up his hands. "Trust me, don't trust me, your choice. But you've got about 15 minutes before proven methods turn into a funeral." Iller glanced between Nolrex and Simon. After a long pause, she nodded. "Let him try." Nolrex exhaled sharply but stepped back, his jaw tight. "Do what you must." Simon moved quickly, scanning the equipment the Marivians had brought. Most of it was unfamiliar sleek devices that hummed with an otherworldly energy, but some of the basic principles were recognizable. He found a bioscanner and ran it over Rylmar's body, watching as the holographic display mapped the ambassador's physiology. What he saw was alarming. Clusters of cells in Rylmar's lungs and liver glowed red, their energy patterns erratic. Simon stared at the display, piecing together the puzzle. The pattern didn't look viral or bacterial, it was more like a chemical reaction. "What's this?" Simon asked, pointing to the glowing areas on the hologram. Nolrex frowned. "Those are resonance nodes. They regulate vibrational harmony in our cellular structures." "Well, they're going haywire," Simon said. "Could something have triggered this? A toxin, maybe." Nolrex shook his head. "Impossible. Our biofilters neutralize all contaminants before they enter our bodies." Simon's eyes narrowed. "What about food or drink?" Iller hesitated. The ambassador consumed nothing aboard the ship before the summit, but he did partake in a ceremonial beverage at the banquet. Simon's stomach sank. "What beverage?" "It was your earth tea," Iller said. "With honey, I believe." Simon froze. "Honey? You gave him honey." Iller blinked. "Is that problematic?" Simon groaned. "Problematic? Honey is full of enzymes, sugars, and trace compounds. It's harmless for humans, but for someone with biofrequency-based physiology, it's like throwing sand into a precision engine." Nolrex looked horrified. "You're saying this insect secretion is the cause?" "Yes," Simon said. "And if we don't flush it out, it's going to kill him." Nolrex resisted at first, insisting that human medicine was too imprecise to handle such a delicate situation. But Simon wasn't in the mood for debates. With Ilor's reluctant support, he assembled a plan: hydrate the ambassador, administer a detoxifying agent, and stabilize his vitals while monitoring for further resonance disruptions. "Do you have anything like activated charcoal?" Simon asked. Iller looked puzzled. "Charcoal? As in carbonized plant matter?" Simon sighed. "Yes, exactly. It binds to toxins and helps filter them out of the system." Iller glanced at Nolrex, who shook his head. "We do not use such crude substances." "Fine," Simon muttered. "We'll do it my way." He prepared a saline IV and hooked it up to Rylmar's arm. As the fluids began to flow, he adjusted the detox settings on the Marivian equipment, using their tech to augment the process. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. Hours passed in tense silence. Simon worked methodically, monitoring Rylmar's vitals and tweaking his approach as needed. Gradually, the ambassador's condition began to stabilize. His heart rate steadied, and his skin regained a faint golden hue. Iller let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He's improving." Simon nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "He's not out of the woods yet, but yeah, he's improving." Nolrex, standing stiffly in the corner, finally spoke. "You succeeded this time, but this does not prove your methods are superior." Simon looked at him, exhaustion clear in his eyes. "It's not about superiority. It's about keeping him alive." As the medbay quieted, Simon slumped into a chair, his adrenaline fading. Iller approached him, her expression conflicted. "You risk much," she said softly. "Why?" Simon glanced at Rylmar, who was resting peacefully on the diagnostic bed. "Because it's what we do. When someone's in trouble, you step in and help. Doesn't matter if they're human, Marivian, or anything else." Iller nodded slowly, as if seeing Simon in a new light. "Perhaps we have underestimated you." Simon chuckled weakly. "Join the club." The following morning, Simon returned to the med bay to check on Rylmar. He found the Grand Ambassador sitting upright, his skin regaining its faint golden glow. Despite his obvious fatigue, Rylmar's posture radiated the dignity of a man unaccustomed to vulnerability. His piercing gaze locked onto Simon as he entered. "You are persistent," Rylmar said, his voice low but steady. Simon smirked. "Persistent beats perfect 9 times out of 10. Rylmar tilted his head, studying Simon as though he were an enigma. "Your methods," he began carefully, "are unorthodox, imprecise, and chaotic." Simon raised an eyebrow. And Rylmar continued, "They worked." Simon chuckled, grabbing a nearby stool and sitting down. "I'll take that as a compliment." Before Rylmar could respond, Nolrex entered the medbay, flanked by 2 Marivian aides. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his discomfort. He strode to Rylmar's side and inclined his head respectfully. "Grand Ambassador, your recovery is progressing. We will resume full resonance therapy immediately to ensure long-term stability." "Not so fast," Simon interjected. "He's still recovering from acute systemic shock. You start pumping frequencies through him now, and you'll undo everything we just fixed." Ulrex's eyes narrowed. "We cannot leave him in a state of imbalance." Simon leaned forward, his tone firm. "He's not imbalanced. He's healing. Let his body do its thing." Rylmar raised a hand, silencing both men. "Enough. Ulrex, I value your counsel, but for now, I defer to Nurse Harrow's judgment. He has earned my trust." The room went still. Ulrex's lips tightened, but he bowed his head. "As you wish, Grand Ambassador." Simon didn't gloat. He knew better than to rub salt in a wound. Instead, he turned back to Rylmar. "How are you feeling?" "Weaker than I cared to admit," Rylmar replied, "but alive. And curious." "Curious?" Simon asked, folding his arms. Rylmar nodded. "Your methods defy logic. You acted without certainty, relying on intuition and improvisation. And yet you succeeded where precision failed. I wish to understand this adaptability." Simon blinked. "You want me to teach you about adaptability?" "Yes," Rylmar said simply. Simon scratched the back of his neck, unsure whether to laugh or take the ambassador seriously. "All right," he said finally. "But fair warning, you're not going to like how messy it gets." Rylmar's first lesson came the next day. Simon had set up a training exercise in the human run section of the medbay. He arranged 3 simulated patients, each with different conditions, and challenged Rylmar to prioritize their care. "You've got a patient with a broken leg, another unconscious, and a third bleeding out," Simon explained. "Who do you treat first?" Rylmar frowned. "I would stabilize them all simultaneously." Simon shook his head. "Not an option. Limited resources, limited time. You've got to choose." Rylmar hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "The one bleeding out, I suppose." "Good choice," Simon said, nodding. "But here's the catch: while you're treating the bleeder, the unconscious patient goes into cardiac arrest. Now what?" Rylmar's eyes widened. "That is an unacceptable scenario." "Welcome to my world," Simon said with a shrug. "You can't save everyone. You do what you can with what you've got. It's called triage." Rylmar's expression darkened. "Such decisions feel cruel." "They are," Simon admitted. "But sometimes they're the difference between saving 1 life or losing 3. The next exercise involved diagnosing a patient based on incomplete information. Simon presented Rylmar with a human patient displaying vague symptoms: fatigue, dizziness, and shortness of breath. "What's the diagnosis?" Simon asked. Rylmar studied the patient for a long moment. "It could be a cardiovascular issue, or respiratory. Without full diagnostics, I cannot say." "Exactly," Simon said. "You don't always get the full picture. So what's your first move?" Rylmar hesitated. "Stabilize the patient while gathering more data." Simon grinned. "Now you're getting it." 2 days later, a real crisis put Rylmar's lessons to the test. A minor explosion in the Federation's engineering bay sent several injured crew members to the medbay. Most had superficial burns or minor concussions, but one, a human technician named Davis, was in critical condition. Smoke inhalation had left his lungs severely damaged, and his oxygen levels were plummeting. Simon was tending to another patient when he noticed Rylmar standing nearby, watching the chaos unfold. "Ambassador," Simon called out, his voice sharp. "You're up. Help them with Davis." Rylmar's eyes widened. "Me?" "Yes, you. You've been training for this. Go." For a moment, Rylmar hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward. The medbay staff, uncertain, looked to Simon for guidance. Simon gave them a nod. Rylmar examined Davis quickly, his hands trembling slightly as he assessed the situation. "Oxygen saturation is critical. He requires immediate ventilation." "Good start," Simon said, stepping in to guide him. Grab that oxygen mask and secure his airway. Rylmar followed Simon's instructions, his movements stiff but precise. Together, they worked to stabilize Davis, administering oxygen and monitoring his vitals. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to buy time until the lead medics arrived. When the chaos finally subsided, Rylmar stood by Davis's bedside, visibly shaken but composed. He turned to Simon, his voice quiet. I acted without certainty, and it was enough. Simon grinned. Welcome to the club. Later that evening, Rylmar sought out Simon in the mid-bay's quiet observation room. He gazed out at the cityscape of New Eden, his expression contemplative. Your people thrive in chaos, he said finally. It is unsettling. Simon joined him, leaning against the window. It's not chaos, it's flexibility. Life doesn't give us neat little boxes to work with, so we adapt. Rylmar nodded slowly. Perhaps adaptability is not as crude as we believed. Simon smiled. High praise coming from you. Rylmar turned to him, a faint glimmer of humor in his eyes. Do not grow accustomed to it. The next morning, the atmosphere aboard the Wayfarer was charged with a kind of nervous anticipation. A diplomatic delegation from the Zuul, a fierce and reclusive species known for their love of secrecy and complex honor codes, had just arrived in the system. The Zuul were notorious for their inflexible traditions and their mistrust of human adaptability. The upcoming summit was supposed to be a quiet affair, a simple meet and greet to discuss trade agreements and the possibility of future cooperation. But Simon had a feeling things wouldn't stay simple for long. He'd been summoned to the briefing room, alongside Ambassador Rylmar, to strategize. As Simon entered, he noticed Rylmar already seated, his posture as regal as ever, though his hands betrayed his nerves, fidgeting with the edges of his ceremonial robes. His unease was palpable. Rylmar had been far more comfortable with human medicine than with the intricacies of galactic diplomacy. Good morning, Ambassador Simon said, slinging his jacket over the back of a chair and plopping down across from him. What's the plan for today? Rylmar looked up, his expression unreadable. We are expected to negotiate, diplomatically, in a controlled manner. Sounds easy enough, Simon said, tapping his fingers on the table. We'll make small talk, drink some tea, and let the Zuul delegation get all impressed by your graceful posture. Rylmar's lip twitched, but he didn't respond. Before Simon could press further, the doors slid open, and in walked Nolrex, flanked by a small squadron of Marivian aides. He was dressed in his customary flowing tunic, and despite the tension in the air, he seemed more relaxed than usual. He didn't sit down, instead standing by the side of the table, watching the two men closely. Ambassador Rylmar Nolrex began, you know the Zuul's expectations. They are notorious for their unconventional approaches to diplomacy. I've studied the records, Rylmar replied, his voice cold but composed. I will be diplomatic. Simon raised an eyebrow. Yeah, but have you seen the Zuul before? I've seen them in recordings, Rylmar replied. Simon leaned forward, his tone conspiratorial. Here's the thing, they're not exactly recording-friendly people. The Zuul don't sit around smiling and shaking hands. They're intense, cryptic, and well, let's just say they tend to interpret things in their own very unique way. Rylmar's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Simon grinned. They'll probably try to make you guess a riddle before they give you a proper handshake. It's their way of testing your resolve. If you fail, they might just consider the entire summit a failure and walk out. A little melodramatic, but hey, that's the Zuul. Rylmar's expression darkened. A riddle. Yes, Simon said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. They love riddles. And trust me, you don't want to be caught off guard. The Zuul are like a walking metaphor. They won't tell you what they want, they'll show you, in the form of paradoxes, ambiguous statements, and absurd logic. You'll need to read between the lines, understand the symbols. Rylmar looked at Simon, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. So you suggest I improvise? Simon chuckled. You could say that. The key to dealing with the Zuul is embracing the absurdity. Think of it as adaptive diplomacy. Rylmar took a long breath and gave a slow nod. I see. And you, Nurse Harrow, will be assisting me in this riddle-based negotiation. Of course, Simon said, his voice deadpan. I'm your resident riddle expert, after all. The diplomatic hall was a sprawling, opulent affair, with soft light filtering through translucent marble walls. At the center of the room stood a sleek, black table, surrounded by representatives from various species, including the Zuul delegation, who had arrived in their signature dark, form-fitting attire. Their leader, Ambassador Zhou, a tall and imposing figure with platinum skin and eyes that seemed to pierce through everything, stood at the head of the table. Rylmar stood tall beside Simon, his face a picture of composed professionalism, though Simon could see the subtle tremor in his hand. They had barely exchanged pleasantries when Zhou's voice cut through the room like a blade. Grand Ambassador Rylmar, Zhou said, his voice cold and rich with authority. I trust you understand the nature of our negotiations. Rylmar inclined his head. I do. Zhou smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was the kind of smile that made you wonder if you were standing in front of a predator. We begin, then, with a simple question. Rylmar tensed, his fingers visibly tightening. Simon nudged him, whispering under his breath, "Get ready." Zhou's smile deepened. What is the shadow that neither moves nor stands still? There it was, the riddle. Simon could feel the tension spike in the room. Everyone was waiting for Rylmar's answer. The Zuul delegation leaned forward, their eyes locked on the Grand Ambassador. The stakes were high. If Rylmar answered incorrectly, the summit would be considered a failure, and their alliance with the Zuul could unravel before it had even begun. Rylmar stood motionless, his eyes narrowing as he considered the riddle. Simon held his breath, silently rooting for him. There was no manual for this kind of diplomacy, no guidebook, just a man and a riddle. Finally, Rylmar spoke, his voice steady. The shadow that neither moves nor stands still is the shadow of a still flame. The room fell silent. Zhou's eyes widened slightly. Then he laughed a low, throaty sound. Impressive, he said, leaning back in his chair. The Grand Ambassador does not disappoint. Rylmar's gaze didn't waver. I came prepared. Zhou's smile softened, though it remained enigmatic. Then let us proceed. The negotiation continued smoothly, with Simon quietly guiding Rylmar through the next few rounds of increasingly obscure riddles and paradoxes. Each time, Rylmar responded with calm precision, his adaptability growing with each challenge. But just when it seemed like the summit would reach its conclusion without incident, the Zuul dropped a bombshell. Ambassador Rylmar Zhou said, his tone shifting from playful to deadly serious. We have one final challenge, one that will determine whether the Federation is truly worthy of our partnership. Simon felt the tension in the room ratchet up again. What is it, he asked, though the words were more out of reflex than genuine curiosity. Zhou's lips curled into a knowing smile. The human. Will you sacrifice your most precious companion for the greater good of your people? Rylmar's eyes flashed to Simon, a moment of hesitation flickering across his face. The question had caught him off guard. It was an ethical trap, one designed to force him into an impossible position. If he chose Simon's life, it could jeopardize the Federation's alliance with the Zuul. If he chose the Federation's interests over Simon's life, well, that was a different kind of diplomatic death. Simon leaned forward and grinned. Oh, no worries, Ambassador. I'm pretty expendable. I mean, I am just the nurse, right? Rylmar didn't laugh. His eyes remained locked on Zhou, unwavering. I will not choose, he said, his voice firm. The answer is this: the value of one life cannot outweigh the potential of many. But no life, human, Zuul, or Marivian, can be truly sacrificed. I choose to build a future where no one has to make that choice. Zhou stared at him for a long moment, his gaze inscrutable. Finally, he gave a single, approving nod. Your answer is accepted. When the summit concluded, it was clear that the Zuul had been impressed, not just with Rylmar's ability to navigate their tests, but with the human influence he had absorbed. The Grand Ambassador had embraced the unpredictable, the chaotic, the human way of thinking, and it had won them an unexpected victory. As Simon and Rylmar left the summit hall, Rylmar turned to him, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You were right," he said. "Adaptability is not just a survival trait. It is a strength." Simon laughed. "Told you. You'll never see a more flexible species than humanity. We can turn anything into an opportunity." Rylmar raised an eyebrow. "I suspect that will be put to the test again soon." Simon grinned. "Bring it on. We're pretty good at dealing with the absurd."